the ruins whispered at night. Not with wind alone, but with voices carried across the dust, half-remembered cries. Fragments of warnings, the ghostly echoes of those who never made it out. Children in the camps told each other stories of her. The alien huntress with ivory fangs and eyes like dying stars. Adults never spoke her name, but Elias Ward had heard it enough times to know it by heart. The pale Fang. They said she hunted for pleasure, not survival. They said she left bones on display like trophies, arranged carefully on shattered walls, as though mocking the fragility of human life. Elias had stopped believing in legends years ago, but belief and survival were not the same thing. As he picked his way through the ruins of the frontier colony, every nerve in his body sang with a warning older than words. The ground was broken here, buildings collapsed into jagged teeth of stone and steel. His boots crunched softly against the gravel. Too loud, he thought. Far too loud. He slowed, crouched low, and pressed a hand against the cracked earth. Silence stretched around him, thick as tar. He was lean, not bulky, made for speed. Not for the brute force soldiers loved to brag about. A scout, not a warrior. His humor was the only shield that had outlived his unit. It was the thing that kept him sane when he slept under broken ceilings and woke with his hand wrapped around the knife at his side. Sarcasm, he had learned, was lighter to carry than grief. Still, grief walked with him. His brother's laughter, gone. His captain's voice, gone. The woman he once dreamed of seeing again, all stripped away by the same empire that had unleashed the pale Fang. And now, Elias walked where others had died, because someone had to chart the ruins, to mark the paths the refugees might use. The sound came then. Not wind, not rubble shifting. It was lighter than that, deliberate. Footsteps too soft, too precise, to be human. Elias froze. His breath caught in his throat, and in that stillness he knew she was here. The pale Fang was hunting him. He turned his head slowly, eyes sweeping over the broken frames of doorways and the black holes of collapsed roofs. The air pressed heavy against his skin. For a heartbeat he saw nothing, but instincts whispered otherwise. A shadow flickered against the far wall, then I saw two faint pinpricks of pale light, hovering in the dark, watching, measuring. Elias's mouth went dry, but he forced a smile he didn't feel. Well, he muttered under his breath, if you wanted a date, you could have just asked. His voice sounded too loud, even to himself. The eyes blinked, vanished, then reappeared closer. The hunt had begun. He bolted, weaving through crumbling alleys, every step measured not just to escape, but to lure. His pack was light for a reason. He had set small traps along the way, crude but clever. Wire strung between jagged beams. A broken fuel cell ready to spark. A pit hidden under loose stones. It wasn't much, but it was better than running blind. The air grew colder as he ran. He could hear her now barely, but enough. A scrape against stone, the whisper of claws. She moved fast, too fast, and every survival instinct screamed that he wouldn't make it. But Elias was nothing if not stubborn. He cut left into a narrow passage, his hand brushing against a dangling line he'd placed earlier. He ducked under it, heart pounding. The sound behind him, sharpened footsteps quickening. Then came the snap. A fuel cell cracked open, sparks catching the air in a brief flare of light. For a split second, he saw her clearly. She was taller than he imagined. Her frame, powerful yet fluid, draped in armor that seemed to grow from her skin. Her face was shadowed, save for those glowing eyes, and the curve of something sharp at the edges of her mouth. She hissed in surprise as the sparks licked against her arm, burning through the thin membrane near her shoulder. It wasn't much a wound, not a defeat, but Elias skidded to a stop and let himself grin through the fear. He had done what no one else had. He had made the pale Fang bleed. Her gaze locked onto him, and for the first time, there was no detached calm in it. There was fury, and beneath it, something far more dangerous. interest. Elias felt his stomach twist, but he refused to flinch. He raised his knife in mock salute, his grin sharp, his voice steady. "Guess I'm not as easy as the others." The pale Fang tilted, her head slowly, the faintest ripple of her breath escaping in the cold night air. And though she said nothing, Elias felt it like a promise carved into the marrow of his bones. The hunt had only just begun. The ruins had grown quiet again. But Elias knew silence was never safety. His lungs burned from the sprint, his knife still warm in his grip. He could almost pretend that nicking her shoulder meant victory. But the truth pressed heavy against his chest. He hadn't escaped her. He had provoked her. The pale Fang was not like the beasts of the wasteland, not a wild predator that could be frightened off. She was something else, something deliberate. She had let herself be seen. She had wanted him to know she was close, like a cat drawing out a mouse. Savoring the moment before the kill, Elias ducked into the shell of a collapsed building, leaning against a wall streaked with soot. The moonlight filtered through the gaps in the broken ceiling, casting skeletal patterns over the floor. He steadied his breath and listened. Nothing, no footsteps, no scrape of claws, just the hum of the ruined colony sleeping under its own ashes. And then something soft, a breath, almost human, carried across the rubble. Elias froze. Slowly, he turned his head toward the sound. There, through a jagged break in the wall, he saw her silhouette. Still as a statue, her head tilted, slightly as if listening to his heartbeat. He grinned, despite the fear crawling in his chest. "Not much for small talk, are you?" he whispered, mostly to himself. The shadow moved, too quick, too fluid. He ducked as the wall behind him split open, claws ripping through stone, as though it were paper. Dust exploded into the air. Elias rolled, stumbling back into the open street. Her figure emerged in full, this time. Tall, armored, eyes glowing faintly like embers. She stepped forward, with a kind of grace that came only from centuries of training or instinct written into bloodlines. She didn't rush, she didn't need to. The way she carried herself said everything. She owned this hunt. Elias raised his knife again, though he knew it was a laughable gesture. His voice came out raw, but steady. "If you're going to kill me, at least do me a favor, make it quick. I've had enough suspense for one night." The pale Fang didn't answer, but her head tilted again, just like before. For a heartbeat, Elias swore. Her eyes narrowed, as though amused. He stepped backward, his mind running faster than his feet. She was studying him. Not just hunting, not just killing, studying. That thought made his stomach churn. The ground beneath him shifted. Suddenly, he had wandered straight into one of the traps he hadn't meant to trigger. The stone gave way, and Elias dropped into a shallow pit lined with jagged steel scraps. He landed hard, the shock knocking the air out of him. Pain flared in his side. He tried to scramble up, but the wall was slick with dust and rubble. Above, she stood at the edge, looking down. Moonlight etched her in silver. She could have ended him then. One strike, one leap. Instead, she crouched, her claws curling lightly against the stone. Her gaze locked onto him, unblinking. Elias spat blood and laughed, the sound ragged. "Well, congratulations. You've caught me. Do I get a prize? Maybe a trophy to go on your wall?" For the first time, something changed in her expression. Her lips parted, and he saw her fangs gleam. But no words came. Only silence, heavy and deliberate. Eli gripped his knife tighter. "You don't scare me," he lied. "You're just another nightmare wearing armor." And then, impossibly, she did something unexpected. She reached down, one clawed hand extending into the pit, not to strike, to pull. Elias stared, confusion slicing through his fear. Why? Why not kill him? Why help him? He hesitated, his heart pounding. She made a low sound, like a growl shaped into syllables. a language he couldn't understand. But the way she said it, slow, deliberate, made it feel like more than a command, almost like a question. His throat went dry. "You want me alive?" Her silence was answer enough. With a sharp motion, she yanked him up from the pit, as though he weighed nothing. She held him close for a second, her glowing eyes burning into his. Elias felt the heat of her breath against his face, felt the coil of muscles in her arm. She could snap his neck in a heartbeat. Instead, she dropped him to the ground beside her. Elias staggered, coughing, trying to find his footing. He looked at her again, truly looked this time, and for the briefest heartbeat, he thought he saw something flicker across her face. Not cruelty, not hunger. Something he didn't expect at all, hesitation. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. She straightened, her expression once again unreadable, the mask of the hunter sliding back into place. Elias wiped the blood from his lip and smirked weakly. "Guess I'm special after all. You don't keep just anyone alive, do you?" Her claws flexed at her sides, but she didn't answer. Instead, she turned sharply and gestured with her head, a motion clear enough, even without words. "Follow Elias." Stomach twisted. This wasn't a hunt anymore. It was something else, something stranger, something far more dangerous. And as he took the first reluctant step after her, a shiver ran down his spine. Whatever game the pale Fang was playing, he wasn't prey anymore. He was something different, and that, he suspected, was even worse. The night was long, but it felt even longer walking in her shadow. Elias followed, because he had no choice, his boots crunching against the fractured stone, his ribs aching from the fall. Every few steps he tried to slow, to stall, to measure the distance between them. Yet each time, her glowing eyes flicked back over her shoulder, and he felt the weight of her gaze press him forward again. She didn't need chains. Her presence alone bound him tighter than any rope. They moved deeper into the ruined colony, away from the faint lights of human camps, into places Elias had only ever marked on maps as no man's land. The air grew colder here, metallic and sharp, filled with the smell of old war machines left to rot. Hulking wrecks of alien walkers loomed in the darkness, their frames twisted and broken, yet still whispering of the power they once carried. Elias's mind spun with questions. Why hadn't she killed him? Why had she pulled him from the pit? Why did her silence feel heavier than words? He wanted to break it, to taunt her again, to slip sarcasm between them like a blade. But the truth was, he was afraid of what she might say back when at last she stopped. It was in a hollow beneath a shattered dome. The walls were half collapsed, but still tall enough to block out the moonlight. This was her den. Elias knew it instantly. Scattered around the floor were remnants of her hunt's burned-out helmets, broken rifles, pieces of armor, too damaged to wear, and bones. Human bones, arranged carefully in a circle along the edges, like the frame of a ritual. Elias's chest tightened. He forced his eyes away, but he had already seen too much. The pale Fang turned toward him then, standing tall, in the pale light, filtering through cracks in the dome. For the first time since capturing him, she removed part of her armor. A helmet of bone and metal clattered softly to the ground. Beneath it, her face was not the monstrous mask he had expected. It was alien, yes, sharp angles, faint ridges, skin like burnished stone, but there was something arrestingly human in her eyes. They were bright, alive, and full of contradictions. Elias exhaled a shaky laugh. So the ghost has a face after all. Her gaze didn't waver. She crouched in front of him, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her body. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she made that same low growl, a word in her language, slow, precise, almost as if she wanted him to understand. Elias frowned. "I don't speak, whatever that is." He tapped his chest. "Elias, that's me." Elias, her head tilted slightly, eyes narrowing. Then she did something he didn't expect. she repeated Etruf, the syllables distorted by her accent, but close enough to make his skin prickle. Elias. It was the first time she had spoken his name. Elias blinked. So you can talk. Guess that makes you more polite than most of your kind. Her lips curved, not quite a smile, but not far from it either. She said another word, softer this time, almost like she was speaking it to herself. He couldn't understand it, but the way she whispered it, with her eyes lowered, made his stomach twist. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a threat. It sounded like a confession. Elias leaned forward, lowering his voice. That's your name, isn't it? Her eyes snapped up, sharp as a blade. She grabbed him by the collar and slammed him back against the wall. The sudden violence stole his breath, dust falling from the cracked stone. Her claws pressed lightly against his throat, not piercing, but promising they could if she wished. Yet her eyes, those bright, conflicted eyes, were burning not with hatred, but with fear. Say it, Elias whispered hoarsely, refusing to look away. Say it again. Let me hear it. For a heartbeat, she hesitated. The hunter's mask trembled. Then, so quiet, it could have been mistaken for the wind, she whispered a single word. Serenya. The name hung in the air, heavy and fragile at once. Elias swallowed hard. He didn't know why it mattered so much, but it did. That name was no legend, no weapon. It was something human inside a monster's shell. He breathed it softly, carefully. Serenya. Her claws trembled against his skin. She should have killed him. Instead, she released him abruptly, turning away, her shoulders stiff as if she regretted every syllable. She stalked to the far side of the dome, her back rigid, refusing to meet his gaze. Elias pressed a hand to his throat, laughing under his breath, though his chest ached. So the pale Fang has a name? A real one. And you just gave it to me. She spun toward him, her eyes blazing, as if daring him to speak it again. He didn't. He didn't need to. The air between them already crackled with a new kind of tension, heavier than fear, sharper than hatred. It was something Elias had never expected to feel for a creature who had once hunted him, something that felt dangerously close to connection. And in that moment, as the silence thickened, Elias understood one thing with absolute certainty. Knowing her name had changed everything. For her, for him, for the hunt, nothing would ever be the same again. The ruins outside the dome seemed a world away. Inside, the air was thick with tension so heavy that even silence felt dangerous. Elias sat on the cold ground, his back to the wall, his eyes never leaving her figure. She stood, with her back to him, her posture rigid, as if holding herself together required all her strength. The name she had given him still echoed in his mind, reverberating with a weight he couldn't explain. Serenya. It felt like a crack in armor, a secret too costly to share. And yet, she had whispered it. To him, Elias broke the silence first, because silence felt like surrender. Serenya, he said softly, testing the word, letting it roll across his tongue like a fragile jewel. Her shoulders stiffened instantly, as though the name itself burned. She turned then, not swiftly, but slowly, her glowing eyes narrowing. Her claws flexed as if she was deciding whether to silence him forever. For a moment, Elias thought he had pushed too far. But, instead of striking, she walked toward him. Every step deliberate, predatory. The way she must have approached countless others before the kill. When she stood over him, her shadow swallowing his frame, Elias forced himself to grin. I'll take it that not everyone gets to hear your name. Her jaw clenched. For the first time, she spoke more than a single word. The alien syllables spilled out like gravel and steel, rough, but laced with a rhythm that hinted at elegance. Elias didn't understand, but her voice, the sound of it sent a shiver down his spine. She finished with a sharp growl, as though the language itself had betrayed her. Yeah, Elias muttered, swallowing hard. I didn't catch most of that, but I think I got the tone. Serenya crouched in front of him, close enough that he could see the faint scars running across her cheekbones, the small details that made her look less like a monster and more like someone who had been forced to survive. Her eyes, though still fierce, flickered with something unspoken: regret, conflict. Elias lowered his voice. "You don't want this, do you? Hunting people like me? You hate it." Her head snapped up, her gaze hardening instantly, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she hissed something sharp, and then struck the ground with her claws, gouging deep lines into the stone. The marks looked like symbols. Elias leaned closer, trying to piece them together. They weren't random. They were words, a story. Through crude symbols and the few human words she forced out, Elias began to understand. She had been chosen to hunt, not because she wanted to, but because her people demanded it. The hunts were not sport alone, they were proof. Proof of loyalty. Proof that she, once a daughter of high blood, was willing to kill humans to earn her way back into her empire's favor. Refusal meant dishonor. Dishonor meant death. Elias stared at the scratched story in the stone, his chest tightening. "So that's it. They turned you into their weapon." Her silence was confirmation enough. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Guess we're both prisoners then, just different cages." For a long moment, neither moved. Then, unexpectedly, reached toward him. Her claws brushed the torn fabric at his side, where the fall had left him bleeding. Elias stiffened, expecting pain, but instead, she pressed her palm gently against the wound. Her touch was careful, restrained, as though she were reminding herself not to break him. Warmth radiated from her hand, some natural heat of her kind, and Elias felt the pain dull slightly. His breath caught not from fear, but from the intimacy of it. "You're patching me up now," he said with a weak laugh. "Didn't think healers was on your resume." Her lips pressed together, the faintest twitch at the corner, almost as though she was suppressing an unfamiliar expression. Not a smile, not exactly, but something close. Elias dared to hold her gaze. For the first time, he didn't see a predator. He saw someone caught between two worlds. Someone whose real name had been buried under duty and blood. But the moment shattered with a sound outside the dome. Heavy footsteps. Voices harsh, guttural, unmistakably alien. Serenya's head snapped toward the entrance, every muscle in her body coiling like a spring. Elias's heart sank. "Friends of yours?" Her eyes flashed with something that almost looked like fear. She turned back to him, and with a sudden fierce grip, grabbed his arm and hauled him upright. She pressed him against the wall, her face inches from his. Her breath came fast, her words rushed, broken but clear enough to sting his ears. "Hide. Quiet." Elias barely had time to react before she shoved him into the shadows behind a slab of collapsed stone. She stood tall in the center of the dome, just as three figures entered, other hunters, armored like her, but lacking her presence. Their voices carried authority. They had come to collect. Elias watched from the shadows, his heart thundering. Serenya spoke to them, her words low and sharp. He couldn't understand, but he heard the edge in her tone. They demanded proof: blood, bones, a kill. She gave them nothing. The standoff thickened. The other hunters pressed closer, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. Serenya's claws flexed, her body rigid. One wrong word, one wrong move, and Elias knew the fragile balance would break. His breath caught as he realized the truth. This was no longer just about survival. She wasn't protecting him because of some game. She was defying her people, and defiance, in her world, carried only one punishment. Elias gripped his knife, his mind racing. For the first time, he wasn't sure who was more trapped, her or him. But one thing was clear: the pale Fang, the monster whispered in human camps, had risked everything the moment she gave him her name, and now they would both pay for it. The air in the shattered dome turned razor sharp, as if even the shadows held their breath. Elias pressed himself deeper into the rubble where she had shoved him, his chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. From his hiding place, he could see the newcomers clearly, 3 of them, armored like Serenya, but bulkier, more brutal in their movements. Their helmets gleamed with polished bone, their weapons still slick with the oil of recent kills. They spread out like a pack, circling her. One spoke first, his voice gravel-thick, the words alien but the tone unmistakable. Accusation, they wanted. Proof human remains, something she should have brought them by now. Serenya stood tall in the circle, claws loose at her sides. Her body language was regal, but Elias saw the flicker of tension in her shoulders. She was cornered, but not broken. She barked something back at them, sharp and cold, her voice cutting like glass. Elias wished he understood the words, but the cadence was enough. She wasn't pleading, she was daring them. One of the hunters stepped closer, holding up a broken human helmet. He dropped it at her feet, the sound echoing through the hollow like a verdict. Elias's stomach clenched. How many men had worn helmets like that? How many never made it back from the ruins? Serenya didn't flinch. Instead, she kicked the helmet aside with casual disdain. Her hand lifted slightly, as if to signal, "I don't answer to you." The largest of the 3 growled and swung his weapon down into the dirt, sparks flashing as metal bit stone. The message was clear: prove your loyalty now, or suffer the consequences. Elias' pulse thundered. His hand gripped his knife, though he knew it was suicide to interfere. Still, his mind raced. If they found him hiding, it would be over not just for him, but for her. They'd call her a traitor on the spot. Serenya's next move stunned him. She stepped forward, closing the distance between her and the largest hunter, her claws raised, not to strike yet, but to show she was unafraid. Her words rolled low and dangerous, filled with venom. The other hunters stiffened. One barked, a laugh, but even Elias could hear the unease under it. For a heartbeat, Elias thought they might back down, but then, the smallest of them sniffed the air. His head turned slightly. He was searching. Elias's throat tightened. They could smell him. Serenya moved fast, too fast to think. She spun, slashing the hunter across the chest before he could move closer to Elias's hiding place. Blood splattered the stones, the sound of the wound wet and shocking. The dome erupted. Weapons rose, claws flashed. Serenya was in motion, all fury and grace, striking before the others could react. She fought like a storm, her claws finding seams in their armor. Her movements fueled not by duty, but by defiance. Elias's heart slammed as he watched her fight her own kind. This was no longer about him, it was about her choice. She wasn't their pale Fang anymore. She was Serenya. The battle was brutal. One hunter fell with a broken neck, another staggered with his arm nearly severed, but the largest one remained, towering over her, his blade crashing down again and again. Sparks flew, dust rose, the ground shook under their weight. Elias couldn't stay hidden anymore. As the giant forced Serenya to her knees, Elias acted on instinct. He lunged from the rubble, hurling his knife with all the strength he had. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The blade buried itself in the giant's side, making him roar and stumble. Serenya seized the opening. With a guttural cry, she drove her claws deep into his throat, tearing through metal and flesh. The giant collapsed at her feet, gurgling, until silence claimed him. The dome reeked of blood and smoke. Serenya stood over the bodies, her chest heaving, her claws dripping. She turned slowly toward Elias, who stood frozen, still shocked he was alive. Her eyes locked on his. In them burned fire, not the cold detachment of a hunter, but something. Roar, rage, relief, and something Elias couldn't name. He tried to speak, his voice breaking. You killed them, your own people." She stepped closer, each movement deliberate, until she was right before him. She lifted her blood-stained claws, but instead of striking, she pressed them lightly against his chest, right over his heart. Her voice came low, fierce, broken into words he could almost understand. For Elias's breath caught. He wanted to deny it, to say this wasn't about him, but the truth hung heavy in her gaze. She had chosen against her people, against her empire, against the duty that chained her. A sound outside shattered the moment. Distant calls. More hunters. Approaching. The bodies wouldn't stay hidden for long. Elias met her eyes, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. Then we run. Together. For the first time, Serenya didn't hesitate. She grabbed his arm, pulling him with a force that brooked no argument. They sprinted out into the night, side by side, their footsteps pounding in unison across the broken earth. Behind them, the Empire would soon know. The pale Fang had rebelled, and beside him, Elias knew he had just stepped into something far larger than survival. He was no longer prey. He was her partner in a war neither of them could walk away from. The night swallowed them whole as they fled the dome, the ruins stretching like a graveyard of broken giants. Elias's lungs burned, his legs ached, but Serenya never slowed. Her grip on his arm was unyielding, her strength dragging him forward as though she refused to allow even the thought of him falling behind. The echo of their pursuers carried across the wasteland low, guttural calls, the sound of armored boots tearing through the rubble. Elias's mind spun. He had seen her kill her own kind. He had heard her whisper her real name. He had felt her claws press against his chest, not to wound, but to claim. Every piece of logic told him this was impossible, that no human could trust an alien huntress, and no huntress would betray her empire for a fragile human. Yet here they were, bound together by a choice that had changed everything. They ducked into the skeletal remains of a tower, its upper floors long collapsed, leaving only hollow ribs against the star-smeared sky. Serenya pushed Elias into the shadows, her glowing eyes scanning the dark horizon. She crouched low, her breathing slow, controlled, the hunter's instincts sharpening into focus. Elias, panting, leaned against the wall, his voice ragged. "They're not going to stop, are they?" Serenya's head turned toward him, her gaze steady, her voice, low and halting, formed broken words in his tongue. "Never hunt until blood." Elias closed his eyes briefly, swallowing the weight of her words. "Then we'll just have to give them more than they can handle." Her lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but into something fierce approval. For hours, they moved like shadows across the wasteland. Serenya's knowledge of terrain kept them ahead, her senses catching sounds Elias never would have noticed: the faint scrape of metal, the shift of sand in the wrong direction, the distant hum of machines. Each time, she guided him away with a silent gesture, her claws brushing lightly against his skin, a touch that burned more than the dangers surrounding them. By dawn, they found shelter in the remains of an ancient transport hub. The walls were cracked, the roof half gone, but the structure provided cover. Elias collapsed onto a slab of concrete, every muscle screaming. Serenya stood watch, her back to him, motionless as a statue. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer empty, it was heavy, charged with things neither dared to say. Finally, Elias broke it, his voice hoarse but steady. "Why me?" She turned her head slightly, one eye catching the pale morning light. "You could have killed me?" Elias pressed, sitting up despite his exhaustion. "You've killed others, but not me. You gave me your name. You fought your own people too. Protect me. Why?" Her jaw tightened, her hands curling into fists. She struggled with words, searching, before finally forcing them out in broken pieces. "You, not pray. You, fight, speak. Different. You, see me." Elias felt his chest tighten. He laughed softly, not out of humor, but disbelief. "See you, Serenya. You're the scariest thing I've ever seen." And yet he stopped himself, catching the weight of what he almost said. Her gaze locked onto his, burning, searching, and yet, Elias exhaled slowly. And yet, I don't want to run from you anymore. The silence that followed was more dangerous than any blade. Serenya stepped closer, the glow of her eyes softer now, almost uncertain. She crouched down in front of him, her face inches from his, her breath warm against his skin. Elias's pulse hammered, but he didn't move away. Her clawed hand rose, slow, hesitant, and brushed against his cheek. The touch was careful, trembling, as though she feared she might break him with too much pressure. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, letting it happen, letting the impossible become real. When he opened them again, she was still there, her expression caught between predator and something far more vulnerable. "You should not," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Danger, death." "Too late," Elias murmured back, his voice rough but certain. "I already chose." Something flickered in her eyes, then a war between instinct and longing. She leaned closer, close enough that Elias could feel the warmth of her breath against his lips. For one suspended heartbeat, the world fell away. There were no ruins, no hunters, no empire, just a human and an alien, bound together by defiance, by survival, by something neither of them could name. But before the moment could tip into something more, the sharp sound of a horn shattered the stillness. Both jerked their heads toward the horizon. The calls of hunters rose again, closer this time. Their respite was over. Serenya's claws withdrew, her mask of the huntress snapping back into place. She rose swiftly, her body rigid, her voice sharp. "Run!" Elias stood, his body screaming, but his heart stronger than it had ever been. He grabbed a rusted pipe from the ground, hefting it like a weapon. "Not this time. If they want you, they'll have to go through me too." For the first time, she didn't argue. Her gaze softened, pride flashing in her eyes. She gave a sharp nod. "Together." And then the hunters came, shadows spilling across the ruins, voices raised in a war cry. Elias and Serenya stood side by side, prey no longer, rebels bound by name and by choice. The final hunt was coming. The morning light bled across the ruins like fire through smoke, painting the jagged stone in shades of gold and ash. Elias stood with the rusted pipe clenched in his hands, every muscle taut, his heart hammering like a war drum. Serenya was beside him, tall and unyielding, her claws glinting faintly in the dawn. For a breathless moment, they were motionless too, silhouettes braced against the tide that was coming. The hunters arrived with the fury of a storm, half a dozen, this time, armored, armed, their voices echoing with authority. They fanned out across the cracked plaza, circling, confident that the pale Fang would either fall back into line or die with her prey. Elias's throat tightened. He was outnumbered, outmatched, a single man with a piece of rusted scrap. Yet, he felt something new burn in his chest, a strange, reckless courage that wasn't entirely his own. It was hers. Standing beside Serenya, he no longer felt like prey. He felt like a partner. One of the hunters barked a command, pointing directly at Elias. The meaning was clear. "Kill him. Prove yourself." Serenya stepped forward instead, her voice rising in a guttural growl that shook the air. It wasn't the cold monotone of the pale Fang. It was her voice, raw, alive, filled with something dangerous, defiance. The hunters froze, stunned, as she declared her true name aloud for all to hear. Serenya. The sound carried like a blade slicing through centuries of tradition. Elias felt it ripple through him, even though he didn't understand the words that followed. He only understood the weight of it. She was no longer pale Fang. She was Serenya, and she belonged to no empire. The hunters roared their outrage, weapons raised. The fight began. Serenya moved first, faster than Elias's eyes could follow. She slammed into the nearest hunter, tearing through his armor with claws sharpened by years of forced hunts. Elias swung his pipe, catching another across the helmet. the shock jolting up his arms. The enemy staggered but recovered, blade flashing toward him. Elias ducked, barely avoiding the strike. Panic clawed at him, but then Serenya was there, pulling him back, her claws raking across their attacker's chest. She fought like a storm, her body a blur of lethal precision, but even she could not hold them all. Elias fought as best he could, striking, dodging, using every scrap of cunning he had left. For every blow he landed, 3 more nearly cut him down, but each time, Serenya was there, intercepting, shielding, refusing to let him fall. One hunter broke through, seizing Elias by the throat and slamming him against a wall. The world blurred, his vision dimming. He gasped, struggling, until Serenya's roar split the air. She tore the hunter away, snapping his neck with a single brutal twist. She dropped him to the ground and turned back to Elias, her hand trembling as it touched his face. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. Her eyes burned with something he had never seen in her before: fear. Not fear of death, but fear of losing him. Elias coughed, his voice hoarse. Still here, not going anywhere. The last of the hunters hesitated, circling. They saw it now. This wasn't a hunt. This was a rebellion. Serenya wasn't just sparing prey. She had chosen a side. With a final feral cry, she leaped into them, her claws a whirlwind of fury. Elias fought beside her, battered and bloodied, until the last hunter fell silent in the dust. The plaza lay strewn with bodies, the air heavy with the scent of blood and fire. Elias sank to his knees, gasping, his chest heaving. Serenya stood over the fallen, her claws dripping, her body trembling from the weight of what she had done. She turned to him slowly. The mask of the pale Fang was gone. In its place was only Serenya, the woman who had whispered her real name in the dark, who had chosen defiance over duty, who had stood beside a human when her world demanded his death. Elias forced himself to stand, stepping closer, his voice low but steady. "They'll keep coming. You know that." Serenya nodded, her eyes burning with a quiet fire. "Yes, always." He swallowed, then reached down, lifting a shard of stone from the ground. With trembling hands, he carved her name into the wall, behind them jagged letters. Rough and uneven, but real. Serenya. When he finished, he turned back to her, his voice breaking, but resolute. "They'll remember you as the Pale Fang, but I'll remember this. I'll remember you." For the first time, her lips curved into something unmistakably a smile. It was small, fragile, but filled with a warmth that pierced the cold dawn. Side by side, they walked away from the carnage, into a horizon that promised only danger. Yet, Elias felt lighter than he ever had. He wasn't prey anymore. He wasn't alone. He had learned her real name, and together, they would carve a new story in the ashes of a broken world.